This morning's talk, entitled Rawls and Humanism, will be given by Martin Carcieri, whom you might remember as the speaker who recently brought us a very well-received talk on Citizens United. This time he will give us his insights as to how Rawls has impacted humanism. So as I thought about this talk, I was wondering if a guy who sings Me and Mrs. Jones should be so closely related and possibly stand as a symbol for humanism. Now, if Mr. Jones had been in agreement, then I'd say okay, but I'll wait to hear what Marty has to say on this before I form more of my opinion. And no one is stopping me. Okay, it's not Lou Rawls. All of us were thinking it was going to be a talk on Lou Rawls as we kept seeing Rawls and humanism. But no, it's John Rawls, as the most influential Anglo-American political theorist of the past 3 centuries. In bestowing the Presidential Medal of Freedom on Rawls in 1999, Bill Clinton noted that he had put our liberties on a brilliant new foundation. That foundation is a refined version of the social contract as developed by early modern thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. It is of particular interest for humanists since it provides an objective but workable basis for politics and ethics. It is neither objective it is neither objective, that is, in the sense of some transcendental foundation like God or nature, nor purely subjective, with the nihilist dead end to which that leads. It is a contract, the basic terms of which, Rawls argues, we would and do accept as the basis of our politics and ethics. Besides presenting the basic method and principles for which Rawls argues, Carcieri will also present Rawls' famous theory of civil disobedience, which builds upon the work of Thoreau, Gandhi, King, and others. Martin Carcieri is an associate professor of political science at San Francisco State University, where he teaches courses and seminars on constitutional law and political theory. He holds a JD and PhD from the University of California and has published 25 journal articles and book chapters, and I presume he probably is not going to sing for us today. Please join me in welcoming Martin Carcieri.
Here we go. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you all very much for coming today. I always enjoy being among friends, fellow humanists. I'm an active member of the Bay Area Humanists up in San Francisco. In fact, Laura and I, wherever she went, we were just at a really wonderful presentation yesterday. So it's especially wonderful to be here with folks whose, I think, general worldview I share. So, as Laura indicated, I teach at San Francisco State University. I was a lawyer in a past life, and it didn't take me long to figure out that I don't quite have the stomach for that. But I'd been teaching for a while by then, and I knew that I'd had some success with that, so I went back for a degree in political science, and I emphasized constitutional law and political theory. Now, John Rawls is, we might say, the state of the art in American political theory, and so I had studied some Rawls in grad school. I took a comprehensive exam question on him, but it was not until several years later, I was teaching at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville for a while, and a really wonderful guy over at the law school named Joe Cook taught a legal philosophy course in the law school that was organized around John Rawls's work. And it was not really until then that I saw the magnificent resource that Rawls is for ordering our thinking about how to go from here. And so what I want to do is present that to you today. And you know, it's a little bit of it may seem a little strange going in, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me, because Rawls, I think, really does offer us a valuable point of departure at least. I find that oftentimes when people disagree with Rawls, sometimes they have some very good points, they identify some weaknesses. In my experience, 9 times out of 10, they don't really understand what he's saying. And so I want to do everything I can today to put Rawls in front of you so that if you agree or disagree, at least you know exactly what the guy is saying. So, okay, let's see, so there's 5. I'm going to say at the outset, Rawls was a liberal in the middle, politically. He not only tolerated those who disagreed, but he sought them out. and respectfully engage them in dialogue. People at the political extremes don't tend to do that. So at the outset, I want to be clear, Rawls is a liberal. Some people call him a socialist, and this is simply not correct. Martha Nussbaum at the University of Chicago called Rawls the most distinguished moral and political philosopher of our age. Peter Berkowitz has described Rawls's theory as the now dominant understanding of liberalism in the academy. And a scholar named Lawrence Solom writes that the only other work on the history of political philosophy to be cited at a comparable rate to John Rawls's theory of justice was John Locke's second treatise of government 3 centuries earlier. So in other words, the book that I'm going to talk about today, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, is the most widely cited work in Anglo-American political philosophy since the 1600s. So I just say this up front so we're clear that this guy has had some impact, and a lot of people, even if at first they didn't quite see what he was getting at, have come to find him pretty convincing. One of his students and later colleagues at Harvard University, a guy by the name of Robert Nozick, great libertarian some of you may know about, said the following about John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice. Nozick wrote that A Theory of Justice is a powerful, deep, subtle, wide-ranging, systematic work in political and moral philosophy, which has not seen its like since the writings of John Stuart Mill, if then. It is a fountain of illuminating ideas integrated together into a lovely whole. Political philosophers now must either work within Rawls' theory or explain why not. Wow. And this is from a guy who ultimately wrote a book critiquing Rawls from a libertarian point of view. So, so I just wanted to start to put in front of us some of the impact that he has had. I have found in writing on Rawls, now applying his theory to concrete policy and constitutional issues, that it's just Rawls's theory is like a jungle gym or a playground, and the better you get at it, the more fun it is, you know. So again, I want to put that in front of you today. Before I do that, the thing I want to do briefly is a little bit of show and tell for later. I brought some of Rawls's books. I promise show and tell, and I deliver. So you're all, you know, after this is over, you're free to come up and take a look at these books. This is the big one. It's called A Theory of Justice. 1971, this book revolutionized political theory. And so that's really the centerpiece of his work. If you're a truly great philosopher, at some point the Cambridge Companion writes a volume on you, and there's a picture of our handsome hero right there. This is the Cambridge Companion to Rawls, a series of articles by major philosophers on different aspects of Rawls' theory. The very last book that Rawls published, this was published in 2001, and Rawls passed away in 2002. This kind of pulled together a lot of threads of his theory. Rawls not only published the most widely cited book in political theory in 3 centuries, but he took the next 3 decades after that to respond to the most able critics of his theory from across the political spectrum. So this guy, and a lot of that is captured in this book, Justice is Fairness, a Restatement. And finally, if Rawls in the mid-90s took a shot at taking his theory and trying to apply it to the extent possible to issues of foreign policy and international relations, this is called the Law of Peoples. It's pretty abstract. I find that I want to shoot myself in the head when I read it because Rawls is abstract to begin with, although I think he's a wonderful writer, but when you start trying to apply a theory to grand schemes of international relations, it gets pretty abstract. So, okay, so let me dive in, folks. I hope everybody has a copy of the handout that I provided in advance. It's just one sheet front and back. So, as we wade into this, I'm going to start with the following. I'm going to say that a great philosopher, like Socrates, asks questions. So a great philosopher asks great questions. Powerful, disturbing, earth-shaking questions. Socrates asked, for example, what is justice? What is virtue? What is a good human life? And by the way, Socrates asked, isn't democracy the worst possible form of constitution except for tyranny? You can see how the democracy eventually put him to death. Anyway, if a great philosopher asks the right questions, I'm going to say that a great theorist and a great political theorist like Plato or Aristotle or Machiavelli or James Madison or Alexander Hamilton or John Rawls, I'm going to say that a great theorist gives answers. So a great philosopher asks questions and a great theorist gives answers, persuasive, compelling answers to good questions. So here's the thing. Rawls, he was born in 1921, took his bachelor's at Princeton in about 44. He was in World War II briefly, and then he came back when the war was over. He went back to Princeton for a PhD in philosophy. He took that. He did a Rhodes Scholarship with H.L.A. Hart at Oxford for a year. H.L.A. Hart is probably the most influential Anglo-American legal philosopher of the 20th century. And then Rawls came back. And he looked around, and it appeared to Rawls by this time that the two leading theories of justice, the two great ethical theories of his day, namely utilitarianism and intuitionism, as much as they have to offer, as much validity as they have to offer, neither one of them will do as an overarching theory of justice. As an example, utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, that's a useful policy tool within limits. However, if we really take that seriously as the ultimate theory of justice, then let's see. Why don't we make the tallest 10% of the population the slaves, the chattel slaves of the other 90%? You can see that this is going to work out wonderfully for most people, right? 90% of the people are going to get the benefit of the slave labor of the other 10%. It's going to be wonderful as long as you're not too tall. Utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. Doesn't matter who we sacrifice as long as we're maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number. So Rawls looked at that and said, as valid as utilitarianism may be within limits, it will not do as a fundamental overarching theory of justice. And so he put that aside. So he sees that utilitarianism and intuitionism, which is a little bit hard, and I'm not saying that I know all the details here in terms of how to explain it completely. Intuitionism has more to do with the idea that the basic, most fundamental truths about collective life are ones that we intuit directly. For example, it is clearly the case that human beings are free and equal in the state of nature. Therefore, when we come into government, when we come into civil society under the protection of government, we ought to be treated as free and equal to the extent possible. Now, so there's some validity to that, but that doesn't get us, it's just a basic principle and it doesn't get us to many details. So what did Rawls do? He looked at both of these approaches, these leading theories of justice, leading ethical theories in the early 1950s, and he says, neither one of those will do. What I'm going to do is go back to the social contract, K for contract, and develop that in some ways. And so this social contract idea, some of you know, had been developed brilliantly by people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant. So Rawls goes back to the contract as a foundation, social contract as a foundation for the basic principles of our society, and he asks the question that I put in front of you on the paper. He asks the following question: what would rational, self-interested individuals, and I'll come back and translate these terms, equally situated behind a veil of ignorance about the details of their own lives, agree to as the basic principles and institutions by which they will be governed forever, in perpetuity, once they know the details of their lives and why? So he asked that question. A great philosopher asks the right question, and then he took 20 years to answer that question in A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1971. And that's what I'm going to present to you today. Now, take a look at this question. He says, what would rational, self-interested individuals? Now, let me say something about each of those very slippery terms. By rational, he simply means the capacity of humans to take means or means that are calculated and likely to achieve their ends. So no matter what your end is, and he's not taking a position on what you or I think is the best life, right? If you want to devote your life to being a competitive chess champion, that's fine. If you want to devote your life to going to cat shows because you love cats, that's wonderful. Your good is your business, and everybody's going to choose their own good. The question is, what would they agree to as the principles in advance that will help them achieve that good, no matter what it is that they decide. What principles would they agree to that would rationally enable them to achieve their good? So rationality here is used simply in the standard economic sense of choosing means well calculated to achieve your goals, whatever they are. Rawls really doesn't have, he's a liberal. He doesn't have a lot to say about what your good or what your good should be. But whatever that is, he's asking, what would we agree to as the basic principles that would allow us to achieve that good no matter who we are? Okay, so that's what I mean by rational. That's what he means by rational. And then self-interested. I want to be clear, he doesn't mean selfish. He means reasonably self-interested. Rawls shies away from extreme assumptions about human beings. It's tough enough to get a theory like this off the ground, and so you don't want to make extreme assumptions about people. So he's not assuming that human beings are essentially just selfish and egoistic. Nor is he assuming that we are basically altruistic and devoted completely to other people. Neither one of those extreme assumptions is really very useful when we're trying to figure out what are the basic principles that should ground society. So self-interested, reasonably self-interested, right? So we're all going to try to pursue the good for ourselves, but we're intelligent enough to recognize that none of us can really have a good life unless a lot of other people have a reasonably good life as well. So he's making a moderate assumption. When he says self-interested, he does not mean selfish. He means reasonably self-interested, a balance, like Aristotle talked about, between one's own individual private interests and public concerns. Okay, so notice how, and again, this veil of ignorance, if you can imagine this just for a second, this is sometimes the toughest part to get people past, a veil of ignorance about the details of our own lives. I'll come back to that in a minute. It's interesting how you'll notice if you've read Socrates, Plato. Like Socrates, Rawls uses ignorance, human ignorance, as a tool or a lever for accessing truth or justice. They don't use it in the same way, but I just wanted to flag that on the way. So again, I know this is a bit of a strange thought experiment. What would we agree to as the basic principles to govern us from behind a veil of ignorance? And I'm going to work on that today to try to get that across, that it is possible for us to do that. But notice that assuming that we can answer that question, what would we agree to if we were behind a veil of ignorance and didn't know who we were going to wind up as? Assuming that we can answer that, this initial situation in which we don't know who we're going to be, but we know we're going to be somebody, legitimizes the principles that are chosen. Because these principles will be chosen without respect to our particular situation. Let me illustrate what I mean. You know, I think Rawls is pretty good, but I can tell you what perfect justice would be. Would you like to know what perfect justice would be? It came to me a few years ago, and it's just gotten clearer over time, and I'm surprised more people can't see it. See, Rawls is good, but perfect justice would be all political and economic power concentrated in the hands of Italian-American men, about 5'10", about 165 pounds. Yeah, 167 around the holidays, you know. That's beautiful vision, isn't it? See, I can tell you can see it, and I can see it, but it's not catching on. And I have been following this issue. Crucial shortage of medium-sized Italian-American men in positions of omnipotence. That's the way the world should be. And I mean, people have suggested to me, wait a minute, Carcieri, aren't you just a little biased in that? I don't think so. I think the truth is just staring us right in the face. But you know, appearance is reality, so we're back to square one, and I think I've made my point. Behind a veil of ignorance, if we can get there, if we can get to that place, it would make no sense to say only people with blue eyes can be doctors, and only people with brown eyes are allowed to have driver's licenses, you know? It would make no sense to do that because we don't know, behind the veil of ignorance, we don't know where we're going to wind up in the lottery of natural and social advantages. And as you well know, that range is quite something. Some people are born into nothing but good advantage situation, naturally and socially, and others are not. So the question is, what would we agree to up front as the basic principles to govern our society if we don't know who we're going to wind up as, but we're going to wind up as somebody? Again, If we can answer this question, this gives those principles great legitimacy because they're not chosen with respect to the particular advantages or disadvantages that each of us knows that we have. We're deciding behind a veil of ignorance. Now, okay, Rawls calls his theory justice as fairness. And he calls it justice as fairness because the principles of justice, as you can already see, are chosen in an initial situation that's fair. This initial situation, he calls it the original position, behind the veil of ignorance. We don't know who we're going to be. We don't know what our health is going to be. We don't know whether we're born into a wealthy family or even, you know, a coherent family at all. We don't know what our race or gender is going to be. We don't know if we're going to have enormous natural gifts or not. We just don't know. And so the question is, ignorance. Given what you don't know, what would you and I agree to as the basic principles to function as the foundation of our civil society once the veil lifts and we do find out who we are? Again, if we can answer that, notice that the principles have legitimacy because they're chosen in that initial situation of fairness. Italian-American men having all the power still sounds good to me, but, you know, failing that, Rawls gives us another way at it. And again, once these principles are chosen, part of the contract, part of the detail is that they apply forever. These are the foundational principles that will ground our society in perpetuity. They are pre-political. These principles are pre-political, pre-constitutional, pre-institutional. They are chosen before we even get about the business of drafting a constitution. And please notice, with contract, this is especially for humanists and atheists, I think, the beauty here is that contract is objective in the sense that it's something that we all agree to. It's not just this nihilist dead end where I can do whatever I want, whatever I can get away with, right? You can't really have a society that way. But it's not rooted in God or nature with all the problems that potentially leads to. It's a contract. So it's objective, but not in that transcendental sense. He gives us a foundation for politics and ethics that's objective, not merely subjective, but it doesn't have the problems of being rooted in God or nature. It's a contract. He says these are principles that we would and rationally do agree to. And again, it may seem a bit strange to approach it this way, but Rawls wrote earlier, he backed off from this a little bit later, but he called this selection of principles collectively from behind the veil of ignorance an exercise of rational choice theory. And let me just suggest that there are people in our society, there may be some in this room, who make their living doing this all the time. That is, there are people in our society, for a living, they try to calculate as best they can how human beings in the aggregate will behave under conditions of uncertainty. Advertisers do this all the time. You know, let me advertise my products so just in case you don't know that you can get a cheaper product just 2 blocks away, you know, let me put outside my building that you can get it here. How would people behave in the aggregate under conditions of uncertainty? Lawyers have to do this all the time. If you know, you're suing my client and you and I don't know exactly what a judge and jury would do with this, so under conditions of uncertainty, how much money should I offer you to make you go away? I think actuarials too. People who have to calculate life expectancy are in the business of doing this as well. So I just want to be clear what Rawls is asking us to do, to try to estimate what is it that people would agree to collectively behind a veil of ignorance under conditions of uncertainty. If that sounds strange and sounds like the kind of thing we can't do, I assure you that there are people in many lines of work who do this for a living all the time. So it is something that is at least maybe possible. So let us assume then that this original position and the veil of ignorance that puts people in the original position are legitimate devices or methods for choosing basic principles. Let me just assume that for a minute now as I proceed. Let us assume that the original position and the veil of ignorance are legitimate devices or methods for choosing basic principles. We now move to the question, what principles does Rawls say we would choose in the original position? Although he concedes that we might rationally agree to some variations, he says that we would select the following 2 principles, and that's the next thing on your handout. He says, first of all, in the veil of, behind the veil of ignorance, what you and I, to protect us no matter who we show up as, we would above all agree to the first principle, which is that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So equal basic liberties, that's what he's talking about. At its foundation, equality and liberty are fused. If you think about it, you really can't have one without the other. Equality, liberty doesn't mean anything unless we're talking roughly about equal liberty. Otherwise we could say, well, cigarette smoking's terrible, but we got to have liberty, but we can put limits on liberty. So let's say men can smoke, but it's a crime for women to do it. We're just drawing a line on liberty like we have to do all the time. No, no. It has to be done in a principled way. You can't just draw a line between the genders without any more explanation than that. Okay. So, so the first principle, equal basic liberties. Each person is to have, each person. So this is liberal. It protects the individual and it advances liberty. So again, Rawls is nowhere near being a socialist, even though some people think that he is sometimes. And I think that this should have some attraction to it, you know. Liberalism is about maximizing liberty. We can't have license. There must be limits on liberty. So that's why he says, each of us have a right to the most extensive system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system for all. So as an example, freedom of speech. You and I can say pretty much what we want to say in this country. But I can list you 10 different exceptions to the free speech principle. You can't go around defaming people with impunity. You can't go around telling lies about people that tend to injure their reputation. That's a limitation on liberty that works for all of us. So again, the most extensive system of equal basic liberties compatible with the like system for others. Notice how that principle protects you and me no matter who we wind up as. No matter how rich or poor, no matter how healthy or unhealthy, no matter how well socially connected we are, that principle protects you and me no matter who we show up as. And so he says that is a principle we would agree to from behind the veil of ignorance. Okay. The second one, he says there's a second principle we would agree to, and that is the following. Social and economic inequalities. So he's assuming that there will be social and economic inequalities. Once again, he's no radical socialist. He's not on the hard left. Social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. First, they are to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Fair equality of opportunity. I'm going to distinguish that a little bit later from formal equality of opportunity. And second, they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Okay. So that second principle, and this is what Rawls says. These two principles, this is it. This is what we would agree to as the foundation of our constitutional order. We would build our laws, we would build our constitution, our legislation, and everything else on that foundation. But this is the foundation. The first part of that second principle, they are to be attached, inequalities are to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. That's called the fair equality of opportunity principle. And then the second one, the second part of the second rule, they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. That's called the difference principle. The difference principle. So let me keep going. What I want to point out about this with respect to these two basic principles is that the first principle, the equal basic liberties principle, each person is to have an equal right, etc., that principle ensures equality where it's essential, more or less in the political and legal domains. The second principle, fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle, manages inequality where it's unavoidable. Let me say that again. I think this is one of Rawls's great insights. Again, he's not assuming that there's going to be radical equality. There will be differences. And some people are going to be wealthier. Some people are going to have more powerful jobs. Rawls is not assuming that we're going to get everybody completely equal. He does say we would agree to equal basic liberties, but there will be social and economic inequalities. But given that reality, he says, All jobs, all opportunities should be open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Notice that equality of opportunity is not equality of result. Equality of result is preferred more by the hard left rather than the moderate left where Rawls is. So fair equality of opportunity. There will be inequalities, but everybody should have a chance to compete for the prizes in society under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Okay, so that should sound fairly attractive. If you don't know who you're going to wind up as, but you know you're going to wind up as somebody in a world where there is a lot of social and economic inequality, you at least want to be sure that you will have fair equality of opportunity to compete for the best jobs, the best paying jobs, the most attractive jobs, and so forth, and other opportunities that society has to offer. And then the difference principle, to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. That's interesting and it's problematic, isn't it? How do we define least advantaged? To play it safe, Rawls defined least advantaged in terms of wealth and income. He was no fool. He recognized that it can get more complicated than that, but, you know, he was just writing one book. He couldn't cover everything. Let me give you an example of what a good concrete example of an expression of the difference principle that I'll bet, especially humanists, would agree to. Would you agree that you and I should be willing to pay a little bit of extra in tax money to provide wheelchair ramps and braille signs in public buildings like public libraries and public universities? Would you think that's appropriate? Would you be willing to do that? Now, even if you're not blind or in a wheelchair, the answer is yes, because of your humanity and your compassion, right? Not only do you and I recognize that but for the grace of whomever or whatever, we could have wound up in a wheelchair or blind and would want those advantages to be provided by society. But if we're really thinking about this, you and I know that you and I are so fragile. And something could happen to put me in a wheelchair today. Something could happen to blind me today. And under those circumstances, given how uncertain life is, I would want to know that I'm in a society that agrees with me that even if I don't need braille signs and a wheelchair ramp, that our society collectively provides those kinds of things for disabled people so that they can have access to places like public libraries and public universities. So that, to me, would be an example of the difference principle. We're not technically talking about wealth and income, but I think there are different ways to define least advantaged. And being in a wheelchair or being legally blind, I think, would arguably qualify. Okay. Let me present a little bit more. Let me present the rest of the front page, folks, and then I'll see whatever questions you've got. I want to, and then with whatever time we have left, we'll get to the stuff on the other side. Appreciate you hanging with me. This is a little bit of a strange exercise, but again, as I told you up front, Rawls revolutionized political theory, Anglo-American political theory, and so it's worth taking a little bit of time with. Now, the next thing on the handout that you see below the two principles of justice, it says the four-stage sequence. Let me tell you about that, because this is also something that Rawls says those behind the veil of ignorance would agree to. Behind the veil of ignorance, we would not only agree to the two principles of justice, but we would also agree to the use of this four-stage sequence as a way to operationalize these two principles, to bring them into concrete rules of law that are going to govern you and me. So you see, under the four-stage sequence at the far left, first stage, we already know about that. The first stage is the original position. That's what I've been talking about so far. The VOI, the veil of ignorance, is thickest there. And that's where we select the two principles. What do I mean? What does Rawls mean by the veil of ignorance is thickest there? In the original position, that's where you and I, behind that veil, have as little information about ourselves and society as possible. We don't know the details of where we're going to live. We don't know what generation we're in. And again, we don't know our particular wealth, health, race, gender, and all the rest of it. And it's behind that veil that we choose the most general principles to protect us no matter who we show up as. Okay, at the second stage, moving over one step to the right, at the second stage, this is what he calls the constitutional stage. This is the stage, you might think of it as being like a constitutional convention. The veil of ignorance is lifted a little bit. You and I still don't know the details of who we are, but now the veil of ignorance is lifted enough that Rawlsian decision makers who have to draft a constitution based on the two principles of justice now know what they need to know to intelligently draft a constitution, right? You can't draft a political constitution for a country if you know nothing about that country. So at the second stage, the constitutional stage, the veil of ignorance is lifted a little bit. You and I, although we don't know our own identities, we know what? We have some understanding of politics, of economics, of psychology. We have some sense of the natural resources that our country has. We have the basic general information that would be required to intelligently draft a constitution. So that's what we're talking about. The veil of ignorance lifts a little bit. We still don't know who we are, but we know enough to be able to intelligently draft a constitution. And what do we enact into that constitution? The first principle, equal basic liberties. That's what a constitution does. A constitution basically embodies equal basic liberties. And let me take a minute to illustrate to you how the U.S. Constitution does this. I'm going to suggest that in many ways, the United States Constitution does embody and protect equal basic liberties. In the first instance, if you've read the Constitution, you know that it empowers government and it disempowers government, doesn't it? It sets up branches of government, but then it puts checks and balances so each checks the other. So it creates government, which we need to protect us from each other, but government itself can be a threat, so we build checks and balances into the system. So in the first instance, we've got institutions of government that are empowered but disempowered to protect our rights and liberties, but not to overreach. In addition to that, equal basic liberties. It seems pretty clear that provisions like the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, these would be equal basic liberties protected under a Rawlsian constitution, no doubt about that. In addition to that, I would say that equal basic liberties in any constitutional democracy would include the right to vote in free, fair, regular elections. Our Constitution guarantees that. In addition to that, I would say, okay, so beyond First Amendment concerns and voting rights, a third major area of equal basic liberty that our Constitution protects, and I think a Rawlsian Constitution would protect, are what's called the criminal procedure protections. The Fourth Amendment, guarantee against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. All the Sixth Amendment rights, so your right to have your lawyer there, the right to confront witnesses against you if you're charged with a crime. And the Eighth Amendment, ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments collectively are called the criminal procedure protections. I submit to you that those would be an aspect of the equal basic liberties built into a Rawlsian Constitution. So what I'm saying is that to a great degree, the U.S. Constitution, even though it's hardly perfect, neither are we, you know. The U.S. Constitution already does embody a number of the equal basic liberties that the Rawlsian delegates would build into their Constitution. So that's how he orients us that way. So again, at the constitutional stage, the veil of ignorance is a little bit thinner than at the first stage, and that's where we enact the first principle into law. We enact the equal basic liberties principle into our Constitution. Okay. From there, Rawls says, we move to the third stage. That's the legislative stage. And at this stage, the veil of ignorance is lifted further. It's almost completely lifted, but not quite. It's lifted still further, and Rawlsian legislators now still don't know the details of their own lives, but they now know enough information about their society generally that they can legislate intelligently. Again, you would want them to have that information. So, Rawlsian legislators, the veil of ignorance is very thin. They know a great deal about our society now, and what's their job? Their job is to enact the second principle into legislation, the fair equality of opportunity principle and the difference principle, working within a Rawlsian constitution. By the time the Rawlsian legislators begin doing their work, there's already a constitution in place that protects equal basic liberties. And the Rawlsian delegates must work within that framework. They cannot suddenly repeal free speech on their own will. They cannot do that. The equal basic liberties are fixed at the constitutional stage. Within that constitutional framework, at the legislative stage, the legislators now go to work. Again, the veil of ignorance is thin. They still don't know who they are, but they know enough about their society to be able to intelligently legislate for that society. And again, what are the basic values that Rawlsian legislators are supposed to enact into legislation? You guessed it, fair equality of opportunity, and then the difference principle. Okay. So they're working within the framework established at the second stage. Okay. So just as an example, let's see. At this legislative stage, the Rawlsian legislators have to figure out, well, what laws are we going to enact in order to protect fair equality of opportunity? Well, let's see. So the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says no state shall deny any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and shall not deny any person equal protection of the laws. I know. Why don't we enact into legislation the 1964 Civil Rights Act? The 1964 Civil Rights Act, which commands non-discrimination based on race and gender in employment, in public accommodations, and so forth, would be a beautiful example of taking equal basic liberties as provided in the Constitution and translating that into fair equality of opportunity. So again, that would just be one example of how legislation would be enacted that carries fair equality of opportunity into effect. As another example, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution guarantees voting rights regardless of race. Women had to wait another 50 years to get the vote, but all right. So if equal basic liberties include the right to vote, then the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the amendments to which were recently before the court, which guarantees the right to vote regardless of race, gender, etc., that would be an example of legislation that would ensure not only equal basic liberties, but fair equality of opportunity. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples there of actual legislation that we have governing us that would exemplify the kind of thing that Rawls is talking about. Okay. So at each stage, the Rawlsian decision makers, the veil is getting thinner. Finally, you see at the fourth stage, this is the stage at which judges and administrative officials do their job, as well as citizens, you and me, voting on state ballot initiatives and such. This is the stage at which the veil of ignorance is finally completely lifted. And the decision makers at that point, judges, administrators, and citizens, you and me, we make our decision within the value choices, within the principles and rules already selected at the first three stages. If you think about it, a judge has to know all the facts, right? For a judge to be able to do his or her job, you have to know the particular names and the particular details of the people who are in court. You have to know all the facts. An administrator at some administrative agency who's trying to sort out some problem has to know, what is it that this business is doing and how is it affecting this other business or individual. You have to know all the facts at that stage in order to resolve the kind of problems that judges and administrators have to resolve. So the veil of ignorance is completely lifted at that stage. For you and me, citizens, at this fourth stage, the veil is completely lifted. For you and me to be able to vote intelligently on state ballot initiatives, we need to know the details of that initiative. So again, the veil is justifiably completely lifted at this fourth stage. So in terms of, it's been said that the Constitution is like the frame or the structure of a house inside of which we can move around the furniture. So if that's the case, then you see that nifty diagram that I got there, computer whiz that I am. You see that? You see that high-tech diagram I put in front of you? You're welcome. So what I'm saying here is that, in a sense, the two principles are the foundation of the structure. The two principles are the foundation. So Rawls is in the business of excavation here. Nothing Heideggerian, right? We're not going 10 miles into the earth. But before we can build a sound constitutional structure, the foundation has to be sound. If the foundation is not sound, the building's not going to be sound, is it? So we start there, the two principles that ground our politics. From there we move to the second stage, which is the constitutional stage, the stage of setting up the structure. Once we've got that structure in place, we move to the third stage, which is legislation. The legislators make the general rules that govern you and me, rules of general application that govern you and me. And then finally, boxed within all of that, we get to the fourth stage, judges, administrators, and citizens. So Rawls, in a sense, not only argues for these two basic principles, but he works into his theory the existing institutions of government that have been there for centuries, for millennia, right? A constitution, legislation, and courts. So he works that in this four-stage sequence as a method, again, for operationalizing the principles as we translate them into more particular rules of law that govern you and me. Okay. Again, these first three stages, the original position, the Constitutional Convention, and the legislature, each one of them involves a particular combination of knowledge and ignorance. And again, so Rawls uses ignorance as a lever to access truth or justice. Now, a couple more things. Let me get the two things at the bottom of the diagram in front of you, and then I'll take any questions that you have. Next thing that I want to mention, at the very bottom of the page, lexical ordering. Let me say something about that. This is an important aspect of Rawls' theory. Under lexical ordering, there is no balancing or trade-offs between the principles. So, for example, the constitutional stage, the equal basic liberties that I talked about before, those are fixed and they cannot be eroded or traded away. The legislature cannot decide, well, let's get rid of free speech. No, no, no. That's one of the equal basic liberties secured at the constitutional level. So there's a lexical ordering. The equal basic liberties are prior to any changes, any legislation that we enact trying to carry the second principle into effect. All right? When the U.S. Supreme Court engages in constitutional analysis and balancing, sometimes it trades off. It'll do a balancing between fundamental equal basic liberties and particular concerns. Sometimes that's justified, it's controversial, but Rawls is clear, for example, that if the veil lifts and you find that, let's say you're in reasonably good health, but you're born into a family with no money, maybe what you'd like to do is some rich person will give you $500,000 if you sign away your free speech and voting rights for life. Rawls says, no, no, we wouldn't agree to that. No, the equal basic liberties are prior and non-negotiable. So these rights are inalienable. They not only can't be taken away, they can't be given or traded away. You might, if you don't have much money, yeah, I'll sell my free speech and voting rights to you for $500,000. Rawls says, no, we take that off the table. No, because that's going to erode a constitutional democracy, right? You're really not going to have a very stable or legitimate constitutional democracy if you do that. So that's what we mean by lexical ordering. The equal basic liberties are lexically prior to the rules of fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle. Okay. Finally, I think the most basic aspect of Rawls' theory, overall what he's doing, is he says that in the original position, behind the veil of ignorance, you and I would prioritize the right over the good. Now, these are the right and the good are the two most fundamental concepts in ethical theory. And I don't claim to understand all the implications of it. Rawls himself, when he talks about it, is a little bit circumspect. But I think the idea is something like this. Rawls says, for example, that we would reject utilitarianism because utilitarianism is the principle of the greatest good for the greatest number. And we've already seen that if we take that seriously, we can just make 1/10 of the population slaves for the benefit of the other 90%. Greatest good for the greatest number. That may be good, but it's not right. Principles of right are those that we would agree to up front at the threshold before we even start pursuing the good. Principles like non-discrimination based on race. Principles like equal basic liberties. Principles like fair equality of opportunity for every person. Principles of right are selected at the outset, at the threshold. And the way that Rawls works it out, only once we've established those principles of right, like the two principles, like the 1964 Civil Rights Act and so forth, only once we fix those principles of right at the outset, only then can we start pursuing the good, both collectively as a matter of public policy and individually in our own lives. The right is prior to the good. That's the foundation of Rawls' theory. The right is prior to the good. You and I may think it's a good thing to sacrifice the tallest 10% of the population because the other 90% is going to be wonderful for the rest of us. That may be good, but it's not right. And Rawls says that's ultimately what is, as great as utilitarianism is, it is ultimately unstable and illegitimate as an overarching theory of justice, because you can just sacrifice individuals if you just ignore principles of right and only pursue the good. And you've already figured out, by the way, that the good is sometimes up for grabs, at best. But look, in a constitutional democracy, we have legislatures that debate about and choose the good. You know, it's maybe good to put money here, but it's better to put it there, so let's decide to do that. That's fine as long as we keep the basic principles of right in place and we don't erode those. Okay, so let me say that I think it should be clear now that Rawls is not on the hard left and he's not on the hard right. He's clearly not a conservative, right? Conservatives on the hard right, I'm not talking some cheesy libertarian variant, I'm talking serious social conservatives, right? For those on the right, liberty is not the ultimate goal of political association. It's virtue. It is the correct use of liberty. So on the hard right, they're going to reject Rawls's pursuit of liberty to begin with. And on the hard right, they really don't think human beings are equal anyway, right? If you're on the hard right, no. Let's not play any games about that. Most people don't have the moral or intellectual virtue required to govern intelligently, so it's best to marginalize them. All right. So the hard right values authority above all. The hard left values equality above all. And even though Rawls clearly has a nod toward equality here, he's not on the radical left by any stretch. On the radical left, it's collectivist, like the hard right, although in different ways. Both the hard left and the hard right reject the individual as the locus of civil rights. On the hard left, it's about groups. We need to radically readjust society so that different groups have different powers in our society. It is liberalism in the middle with different variations that protects the individual person as such. The moderate right, I would say, is classical liberalism, libertarianism, and so forth. They share a lot of the views of Rawlsian liberals on the moderate left, but they're going to disagree about what? The scope of government required to make individual rights a reality and to make them valuable. Anyway, I could go on about that. I just wanted to situate Rawls here. He's not on the hard left. He's not on the hard right. And even though he's got some things in common with the moderate right, the libertarians, again, libertarians generally want much less government involved in trying to make equality of opportunity a reality. A libertarian on the moderate right will say, you and I should be able to compete on an equal playing field for jobs and such, but don't expect me to pay tax money for your public education. I did not create you. I did not create your problems. I owe you nothing. That would be more of a libertarian view. Rawls, he's not on the hard left. He's a liberal, but he's saying behind the veil of ignorance, we recognize that any one of us could wind up in any position in human life, so to make sure that we're all protected, we're going to commit to providing government big enough that everybody gets fair equality of opportunity, equal basic liberties, and so forth. So let me stop it there. Let me take any questions that you have. Okay, and Martin, I'll let you, thank you. If you like it. To Rawls.
Okay. There's two that had their hands up. I'll go first, and then who else? You've got a question. 1, 2 at the front, 3. Okay, 3 at the front, 2 at the back to start.
And I'm going to walk amongst you because I have slight hearing loss. Yes, sir.
When we talk about gradual lifting of the veil of ignorance.
Yes.
Let's suppose we get to a stage where we already have a constitution in place.
Right.
But does that mean that people still do not know personally where they're going to be involved, whether you're going to be rich or poor, unhealthy, stupid, or intelligent?
Correct.
So when you say the veil of ignorance is lifted, it means lifted to the sense you know what the Constitution is going to be.
Right.
But you still don't know anything where you're going to be in society. You
Correct.
Don't know, is that okay?
That's right. That's right.
So
yep, that's right.
So
the veil does not completely lift until after the third stage.
Right. Right. But there's one part of the veil that's not lifted at all. That is, you don't know at all where you're going to be.
Right. That's right.
Right. Now, after you know where you're going to be, that's a game changer, right?
Yeah, but you know what?
People,
by that time, the Constitution. But yeah. You're right. That is a game changer. Once I know who I am, well, now it's obvious to me. Italian-American men ought to have all the power.
Right.
But I've already agreed behind the veil of ignorance, like all of you have, to basic principles that protect me no matter who I am.
Right. But then the biases creep in as soon as people know where they're going to be. Right.
Yeah. No, nobody can cheat. Right. You can't know. The veil gets lifted at the last minute for everybody at the same time. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I really like your thought experiment about the veil of ignorance. You know,
it's Rawls' thought experiment.
Rawls it is brilliant.
It is.
And you talk about this as not coming from either, you know, a deity or a natural world. I would suggest that there are principles in the natural world that lead to this fundamental idea of rights and stuff, and that is hinged on the survivability of the human race, you know, the positive evolution of the human race. And as a thought experiment, I would suggest that suppose I go out with a telescope today and I find an asteroid that's 20 miles wide that's going to hit the Earth in the year 2060.
Sure.
So everybody's going to get wiped out in the year 2060 unless scientists figure out a way to stop that asteroid or move that asteroid. Then, you know, innovation, you know, it becomes a principle of society that we have to support the smart people, the scientists and stuff, to go out and figure out a way to save the world.
Wow, okay.
And I would suggest that, you know, from the natural world, you know, if you take the principle of positive evolution, which of course includes survivability, that you can derive, you know, it's another level more fundamental than the thought experiment that you suggested, and that, you know, that the universe itself has actually set up a method to determine right and wrong, you know, that's scientifically discoverable and objective. What do you think about that?
Wow, you covered a lot of ground there. I like what you're saying. Let me just say that there are situations, and the one you describe is one of them, where Rawls' theory just would not work, right? Another example where Rawls' theory clearly would not work would be a war zone. Imagine, rather than a relatively civil society, you and I were dropped in the middle of some part of Syria right now, right? Where anybody you look at could, you know, be wanting to kill you. Clearly, Rawls' wonderful theory of constitutional democracy is not going to work there. So the thing you remind us of, which is very valuable, is that Rawls' theory only works within certain conditions, where you've got a reasonably just society, reasonably, not perfect, but a reasonably just society with a reasonably sufficient amount of resources that we're not all at each other's throats and starving. If people are if humans are in desperate circumstances, clearly Rawls' theory is not going to work. And so the example you gave of, okay, suddenly we know that, 50 years out an asteroid's going to hit and we need to solve some problems here, that would be a game changer. And I think at that point, Rawls' theory really wouldn't make much sense. Fair enough. Very good. Who's next, please?
I think we've just got a few minutes before lunch.
Yeah,
so.
Go ahead. Yes, sir.
I have 3 short questions.
3 short questions.
The first one is, I have heard many times the sentence that says that the right, or we could also say the liberty of each person ends where it infringes the right or the liberty of other people, you know. Right. Is that similar to the first principle?
Exactly right. That is exactly right.
The second question is, instead of, as I say, semantic question, the veil of ignorance could sound a little offensive to some people, not to me because I understand what you mean. Should it be called better the veil of uncertainty based on what you said?
Very good. Good point. I actually think that ignorance is not a bad word. I think it's just descriptive of human beings. I'll be the first to tell you, I mean, I'm an ignorant man. There's so much I know nothing about. So I think Rawls is using that term not in any kind of derogatory. He doesn't say the veil of stupidity, for example, right? We're all ignorant, but we're not all stupid.
It sounds a little
Yeah,
like that.
there you go. Very good.
The third last question. This lecture was excellent, one of the best I ever heard. Would you be willing to give us another lecture about the disobedience, because there was no time to touch it today?
Sure. Talk about the other side of it? I'd be glad to. Yeah, I'd love to. I can't refuse humanists. I'm among friends. I'm among family here, right? I can't refuse you.
So I'm afraid...
You guys got to come up to the Bay Area Humanists, though, and attend some of our stuff, like Laura does and Arthur sometimes.
Announce your events here, and then we'll know about them.
Very good.
So lunch is ready and going cold, so I'm afraid we'll have to stop there, and people can ask more questions.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, folks. Good to see you all. Thank you.